Bom dia a todos e a todas. Eu sou Maria Cristina Garcia Vasconcellos, atual presidente da Sociedade Psicanalítica de Porto Alegre, e desejo a todos que sejam muito bem-vindos aqui na nossa casa virtual para debatermos um tema tão importante nos dias de hoje, em que situações de intolerância e discursos de ódio têm ganhado espaço não só aqui no Brasil como no mundo. É com muita satisfação que recebemos os doutores Shmuel Erlich e Mira Erlich-Ginor para nos apresentar o trabalho que eles vêm realizando sobre resíduos transgeracionais e traumatização histórica. A atividade é resultado das discussões que vêm sendo realizadas no Comitê de Estudos sobre Intolerância e Preconceito de nossa sociedade, que tem o objetivo de compreender esses fenômenos humanos da intolerância e do preconceito do ponto de vista da psicanálise. Antes de passar a palavra ao Dr. Cláudio Eizirik, analista Didata de nossa sociedade e ex-presidente da IPA, que irá apresentar os nossos convidados, eu gostaria de lembrá-los para não fazerem comentários pessoais ou sobre material clínico, uma vez que essa atividade está sendo gravada e poderá ser publicada no YouTube. Também eu quero avisar que a gente vai projetar na tela o texto que será apresentado pelos nossos convidados, e ele vai ser apresentado em português, então nesse momento as tradutoras não vão traduzir, não vão fazer a leitura do texto, elas vão só ler as duas primeiras palavras de cada parágrafo para que vocês possam se situar onde é que está, em que altura do texto está sendo apresentado, tá? Então desejo a todos uma boa manhã de discussão e Cláudio, é contigo a palavra agora.
Obrigado, Cristina. Bom dia a todas e a todos. Meu nome é Cláudio Eizirik, sou da SPPA. E, como disse a Cristina, esta atividade é do Comitê de Intolerância e Preconceito da SPPA, que começou suas atividades em março de 2021, coordenada pelo Dr. José Carlos Caliche e por mim, e atualmente ela é coordenada pela doutora Maria Cristina e por mim. Depois de um ano inteiro de intensas leituras e estudos sobre diversos temas ligados à intolerância e ao preconceito, este ano nós dedicamos à leitura e ao estudo do livro Alimentados com Lágrimas, Envenenados com Leite, sobre o qual vocês vão ouvir falar. E, a partir daí, organizamos essa atividade com os meus queridos amigos Shmuel Erlich e Mira Erlich-Ginor. O Shmuel é analista Didata e ex-presidente da Sociedade Psicanalítica de Israel, ex-coordenador do Comitê de Educação da IPA, no qual teve um papel decisivo na discussão e aprovação dos 3 modelos de formação analítica. Atualmente, ele é coordenador do Comitê de Assuntos Institucionais e ele é um dos fundadores do Parceiros no Confronto de Atrocidades Coletivas, Partners in Confronting Collective Atrocities, que recebeu, em 2019, o Prêmio Sigourney, que é o mais distinguido prêmio da psicanálise internacional, que o Shmuel já tinha recebido pelo seu trabalho psicanalítico em 2005. A Mira Erlich-Ginor é analista Didata da Sociedade Psicanalítica de Israel, é coordenadora do Comitê da IPA na Comunidade no Mundo, é fundadora e executiva do PCCA, essa instituição que os dois fundaram com outros colegas. E ela tem um intenso trabalho, tanto na Federação Europeia como na IPA, publicações, tanto junto com o Shmuel como individualmente. Então, ambos têm uma presença muito forte na psicanálise internacional e é um grande prazer e um grande orgulho para nós recebê-los aqui na nossa casa. Eu queria também acrescentar que eu tive a oportunidade já de participar de algumas dessas atividades que eles vão descrever, tanto em Berlim, como em Beijing, como em Varsóvia, e vamos fazer uma proximamente no próximo congresso da IPA, em Cartagena, de modo que, nesse momento que estamos vivendo, como disse a Cristina, de tanto ódio, de tanta intolerância, é muito importante podermos ter um olhar psicanalítico sobre esses fenômenos tão preocupantes. Então, com a palavra, bem-vindos. Welcome, Shmuel and Mira.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cláudio. Are we all now? Okay. First of all, both of us, Mira and I, are thrilled and very grateful for this invitation. We are very happy that you are actually taking an interest in our book and our work, and for this invitation to go a little bit deeper even into discussing this work with you today. And it is, of course, a personal great pleasure for me because of a long-standing friendship and working together with Cláudio when he was IPA president, and we did some things together, and it's a relationship that I really cherish. So thank you so much for inviting us, and we will first present a paper that I will read, and then Mira will add to that to bring it up to date in terms of our current work that has to do with the war in the Ukraine. So I start with the Holocaust. The Holocaust, the systematic annihilation of Jews by Nazi Germany as its programmed final solution of the Jewish problem, is one of the most horrendous destructive acts ever witnessed. It is a systematic annihilation of a people by means of the most advanced technological and industrial achievements of 20th century civilization. It is sometimes difficult to speak of the Holocaust in other cultures because the Holocaust is essentially a European phenomenon. It took place on European soil. It was perpetrated by a culturally leading European nation, Nazi Germany, and its roots are deeply embedded in the historical European struggle between Judaism and Christianity and the pernicious anti-Semitism that grew out of it. But although it took place nearly 80 years ago, the shadow of the Holocaust and its radioactive fallout continue to poison the lives of descendants of both perpetrators and victims in the most palpable ways. The Holocaust is therefore a vital example of the profound way in which historical trauma continues to affect the lives, minds, and psychical well-being of future generations, even though they did not directly experience it. It is a poignant and painful illustration of the extent of the inhuman, or perhaps very much human, atrocities that individuals, large groups, and modern states are capable of. Although we feel the Holocaust is unparalleled and unique in human history, the perpetration of extreme atrocities has many parallels across other continents as well. We are all familiar with the atrocities of the Japanese, the Khmer Rouge, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the genocide in Rwanda and Rohingya, the more recent Syrian atrocities, and the current devastation of Ukraine by its civilian population by Russia. An accompanying aspect of the need to work on the residual effects of such atrocities is the powerful tendency to deny their existence and thus get rid of the associated guilt and aggression. Holocaust denial, only 80 years afterwards, and while survivors are still alive, is gaining momentum. It is an attack on the possibility to mourn and to move on internally. As psychoanalysts, we must do our best to understand the roots of such human cruelty and capacity for destructiveness. We will not repeat what has already been written, beginning with Freud's Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, and Why War, and more recent examples such as Discourse with an Enemy and Understanding the Terrorist Mind. We believe that the approach and method we have developed for working with the after effects of the Holocaust deserves attention and reflection and is applicable to similar situations and circumstances. It took many years and overcoming huge psychological barriers for the experience of the Holocaust to be put into words and to become subject to internal work. Yet 80 calendar years are not a long time on the interpsychic timescale. For the past 30 years, we have initiated and conducted, together with colleagues from Germany, Israel, England, and elsewhere, a series of group relations conferences designed originally to work with the residual effects of the Holocaust on the lives of German and Israeli psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, and mental health professionals, as well as affected others. We founded and developed an organization dedicated to continuing and promoting this endeavor, PCCA, which stands for Partners in Confronting Collective Atrocities, and as Cláudio has already mentioned, which was awarded the Sigourney Award in 2019 in recognition of its outstanding psychoanalytic contribution to working with the residues of trauma. So in what follows, we will briefly describe the group relations approach and try to illustrate the processes that take place in these conferences with a few selected examples. Finally, we will discuss certain aspects of the work and some of the themes that emerge from it. And we will end with its most recent application, addressing the war in the Ukraine. So what is the group relations approach? Group relations conferences are a unique adaptation of psychoanalytic exploration and understanding combined with open systems theory. The psychoanalytic basis for this work is firmly grounded in the drive and object relations concepts of Melanie Klein, such as splitting, projection, and projective identification, good and bad internal object, destructiveness, guilt, and reparation, and so on, and Wilfred Bion, such as the group as a whole transference, dynamics of basic assumption groups versus work groups, valency, and so on, as well as later developments, such as Turkey's work on large group dynamics. Open systems theory has contributed important structural concepts and insights that affect the life of social entities, organizations, and institutions, such as role, boundary, and primary task, and the place and function of leadership. The group relations methodology, which is based on the integration of both approaches, was developed by the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London in 1957 and has since spread globally. Typically, group relations working conferences center on aspects of authority and leadership. They are geared towards learning from one's own experience in the various group settings provided: small and large study groups, review and application groups, plenaries, and an intergroup or organizational system event. The learning is entirely individual and experiential and involves in both here and now and evolves, in both here and now and more action-oriented settings. There are no lectures or presentations or didactic aspects. The theory, in a nutshell, of the group relations conferences. Group relations conferences are designed to be a safe container. This is achieved by providing a combination of strong and clear boundaries and interpretations. The most evident boundaries are those of time, space, and task. Every event starts and ends at a precise time and in a specified territory. Staff members function and stay in role. These strong boundaries provide the necessary conditions for a certain regression that takes place when one's habitual roles are unclear or irrelevant and defenses are diminished. The experience is typically of being in a new and unknown psychic space. It is a challenging state of mind, anxiety-provoking, yet pregnant with potential for discovery and creativity. The staff in these conferences has a complex task. They act as consultants to the various events, and they form the management that maintains the boundaries in which the event is held and unfolds. They are available for receiving projections and interpreting them. The interpretations usually pertain to the here and now and are built on countertransference and identifying processes of projective identification. Each staff member works with several group configurations. The staff also works as a group in which the task is to decipher and understand what happens in the conference as a whole. The fact that there are usually 9 to 12 staff members provides opportunities for differential projections because they come also from very different backgrounds. The work as staff can be meaningful and also highly emotional. How did we develop the Nazareth Conference's design? Our work initially centered on the two nationality groups involved in the trauma of the Holocaust, Germans and Israelis. It gradually expanded to include affected others, Palestinians, Europeans, victims and perpetrators, and boundary issues. Most recently, we have worked with Ukrainian analysts and psychotherapists traumatized by the war in the Ukraine, and an event that explored the experience of this threatening current war, about which we'll speak later. In all, there were 15 conferences so far in Nazareth, in Bad Segeberg, Germany, in Cyprus, in Klitschko, Poland, in the Netherlands, and 2 recent virtual conferences by Zoom. The usual format of a group relations conference is based on individuals signing up as individuals. This format had to be adapted for working with 2 a priori identified nationality groups. All of this is, of course, fully described in our book, On the first 3 conferences, the book is called Fed with Tears, Poisoned with Milk. Now, we will include brief excerpts from these proceedings as illustrations. The most essential point in this work is that each national or ethnic group needs the actual presence of the other one in order to be able to do its own internal work, whether on bereavement, aggression, guilt, revenge, or deprivation. We suggest that this method provides a potentially valuable approach to working with other instances of ethnic, religious, and nationalistic atrocities and their residues in other parts of the world as well. I am so disappointed. Why are there so few Israelis here? This question by a German analyst opened the first conference. An immediate answer came from an elderly Israeli woman. If you had not killed so many of us, there would have been more here. This painful, dramatic exchange launched a series of working conferences in which German psychoanalysts met with their Israeli counterparts. These conferences gradually evolved to have a life of their own. They have a historical past, an intense and absorbing present that is different for each one, and a yet unknown future. We will try to provide a picture of what transpired and surfaced in these meetings, but it should be made clear at the outset that our effort, sincere and serious as it may be, cannot be wholly successful. What we describe is highly experiential and personal. Just as in an analysis, it deals with learning through and from one's own personal experience. In a deep sense, each conference participant has her or his own unique conference. It is nearly impossible and to an extent misleading to describe and to generalize about it. So here are some vignettes from these conferences. So we will focus first on the 3 conferences of Germans and Israelis, taking examples from the collage that participants have written about the conferences, which are part of our book. These fragments provide some of the emotional flavor as well as the dilemmas inherent in this work. First is a short self-presentation with anxieties and deliberations about participating in the conference. Who am I? Why did I come? Etc. A German woman writes, unless asked or introduced, it would never occur to me to want to tell someone who I am, as this would reveal me as being German. It feels easier, more bearable, to be no one, non-existent, than having to face the feelings connected with being German. An Israeli man writes, but do I really want to? I don't feel like coming. It's too heavy. Once I see myself as an American Jewish soldier coming to this Nazi country in 1945, and once as a fearful Jew who tries to get lost unnoticed during the war. Otherwise, he will be shot on the spot. I fear that I'll not be able to sleep all the nights there, and everyone will see how frightened I become being on this land, Germany, and not be able to distinguish between fantasy and reality, between history and here and now reality. What is the reality anyway, when a Jew is walking freely in Germany, and yet there are still those who would rather wish him dead? But is it not a good enough argument? Because here, meaning in the Middle East, we are not so welcome either, and nevertheless, I'm staying. A German woman writes, last week, my father died at the age of 81. Since then, I think even more than before that I am not personally responsible for what has happened. I knew this before, but now I think so even more. I presume that he was one of those horrible soldiers in the last war who killed anyone he could, even those he just wanted out of the way, like mosquitoes bothering him. During my childhood, I feared that he would kill me if I dared to say something about him that he didn't like to hear. This danger overshadowed my life. My father accused me of wishing to kill him. I'm glad that he died of illness and old age. I did not kill him after all. Another German woman writes, participating in such a conference is like a walk in the mountains. There are beautiful moments and dangerous parts. And afterwards, everybody tells another story, what impressed him or her most. You may be astonished of how deep precipices are trivialized afterwards. An Israeli woman, I found out that the most powerful resistance came from my wish to keep my hatred alive and my enemy focused, clear, and unchanged. It was one of the ways to remember the Holocaust and not to feel a traitor to my people and to my family. Moreover, I could sense that in some ways, the feeling of hatred gave me a sense of power that I found hard to renounce. Let us now zoom in on some of the events to illustrate the emotional and unconscious themes that come up. These examples are taken from the only conference held in Germany. So first, the plenaries. All participants, members and staff, take place in the plenaries. In the opening plenary, which is the entry point into the conference, an Israeli woman asked herself why she came to Germany. It did not seem to make sense now that she was here. A German woman spoke about her fear to attend the conference. She had planned her coming for 4 years. In anticipation, she asked her parents for the first time what they did during the war. Their response was to sever their relationship with her. She felt devastated and cried bitterly. Another German woman, in a flat, affectless voice, stated, I am the daughter of an ordinary Nazi mother, to which an Israeli woman countered, and I'm the daughter of an ordinary Jewish Nazi mother. This phrase had an immensely compelling force. It immediately became the leitmotif and title for many subsequent contributions. In another plenary towards the end, an Israeli man related his telephone conversation with his mother. He told her that after the conference, he planned to travel to Berlin with his new German friends. And his mother said to him, don't go with them. They killed your grandparents. The theme of mothers, ordinary Nazi and otherwise, and what they passed on to their sons and daughters emerged as central in this conference. It was elaborated and extended to include ordinary Jewish mothers as well as Jewish Nazi mothers. It found expression in the poignant image of an Israeli woman consultant who said, I was milked with tears. And this was immediately followed by a German woman who said, and I was milked with poison. This was a powerful, nearly palpable image of being suckled at the breast and taking in with one's mother's milk the poison that came with it, whether depression or murderousness. This peculiar verbal construction, milked, which doesn't exist in English, not in this sense, made immediate sense and was taken up quite naturally. It evoked the underlying double meaning in which mothers were experienced as giving suckle, milk, and at the same time as milking and draining their children. Now a look at the small study group. The small study groups are composed of 9 to 12 members of different nationality groups, meeting with a consultant. Language and its powerful, pre-conscious way of surfacing unconscious and buried issues became an immediate focus. Innocent words on the building floor plan were loaded with meaning, like Lager, which means storage room, but it also means concentration camp, and Gruppenraum, which means group space, but which also connects with Lebensraum. The German environment was suffused with its cultural symbols and overtones. For some Israelis, it was painfully connected with smells and tastes of food and cooking, trees and plants, and aspects of the physical surroundings, the sharp, unexpected surfacing of deeply missed childhood smells and tastes. The immediacy of so many forgotten, forbidden, and repressed memories made it difficult at first to speak in the small group. People spoke in hushed tones, in almost inaudible whispers, as in a house of mourning. No names were given or asked for. This changed suddenly when an Israeli woman said, "I am named Sarah, after my grandmother." She and the group experienced this simple, ordinary statement as if a bomb was dropped in the room. Another scene. All the women are dressed in black. The members are all mixed, surrounded by each other's nationality. Death and mourning are in the air, as well as the wish to let go of the burden of one's national identity. The manifest theme is poison and paranoia, being betrayed by one's parents, the world as a sick, cancerous place. The real danger, however, is shifts and changes in one's identity. The discussion turns to snow and winter, and the consultant offers the association of a Schubert song, which means frozen tears. Dead parts of selves are buried under the snow, perhaps still alive. The question is posed, were the Israelis brought to Germany to thaw out the frozen German parts? In the last small group session, members sit in the same nationality pairs. Again, they talk in hushed voices, as if in the presence of the dead. It is as if the deceased parents are present and circling the group circle. Beside the mourning and veneration, there is the fear of invading the space of the other. The work of refinding one's lost parts must proceed cautiously so as not to violate the space and identity of the other, who is now so very precious. Now a look at the system event. Perhaps the most telling and central event in the conference is a system event. The two nationality groups start separately in different locations, with the option of forming groups in different locations, as well as the potential for meeting the other nationality groups. The staff group is in its own territory and participates in two ways. It carries on its work as usual, but in full public view, so that members can observe it and interact with it. The staff is also available to provide consultation to the members' groups. The staff intervenes in the development process or processes by issuing working hypotheses, actually interpretations, which express its view of what is happening in the event at that moment. The atmosphere in the system event is typically quite intense and charged. It may, however, sway from euphoric excitement and manic feelings of being powerful and accomplishing something to utter confusion, depressive passivity, and dangerous resignation. In the first two Nazareth conferences, the German group was seen as efficient, active, and powerful, while the Israelis seemed passive, helpless, and resigned. An intervention by a consultant in the first Nazareth conference was that while the Germans were marching, the Jews sat and debated what to do. In the conference in Germany, the Israeli group, quite unlike the previous conferences, became extremely active. There was a leadership struggle in it, resulting in a powerful group taking over with a sense of mission and purpose, of knowing how to play the game and getting it right. This created resentment and disunity among the Israelis. Some of them experienced it as a fascist takeover with which they could not identify. Several Israelis left their group to create or join other groups. The first to leave was an Israeli man of the pre-war generation who wanted to create a group together with Germans to investigate events in Germany from 1933 to 1945. For a while, he was a singleton, that is, a group of one, wandering around in disarray like a refugee in flight, carrying plastic bags with his belongings. 7 or 8 Germans who provided him with shelter and protection later joined him. The name adopted by this group was the German Catastrophe. An Israeli woman came to the staff in a stormy, highly charged emotional state. She wondered if the staff knew what was going on outside. She felt confused, angry, and disoriented. She could not see what all this had to do with her grandparents who were murdered in Auschwitz. The German group, which in the previous conferences was quite active, was more passive and subdued this time. Acting in an orderly and democratic fashion, it became beset and plagued by procedural debates. The group stayed in paralysis until it asked for and received consultation, which freed it up. It then formed several subgroups, which were joined by Israeli members. The titles these groups took were instructive: on violence and sentimentality, an all-women group, lack of safety, the murdered and the murderers, and the German catastrophe already mentioned. Throughout this conference in Germany, in sharp contradistinction to Nazareth 1 and 2, there were repeated defensive enactments, as at first totally unconscious, of German incompetence. This took on several faces. The Germans idealized the competence of the Israelis and unjustly downgraded their own. There was evidence that of the Germans lobotomizing themselves, cutting off their heads and brains, their capacity to think and feel. They often complained of their inability to think and to use their intellect, an experience bordering on madness. This was linked to an observed German tendency to carry on as inadequate, incompetent, and tongue-tied in international meetings. It was accompanied by a tremendous amount of shame and guilt. It was also evident that the Germans longed for their Jewish colleagues and counterparts. They felt deprived, severely handicapped, and lacking without them. They longed desperately for the taste of the Jewish breast and milk, of which they had ridded themselves. Following the first three conferences on Germans and Israelis, the scope of the membership, as well as titles, gradually expanded to include others, diaspora Jews and Palestinians. The conference next moved to Europe, first to Cyprus, then to Europe, where the focus was on victims and perpetrators, then and now in Poland, and walls open, closed, sliding in the Netherlands. A conference in Cyprus in 2019 was titled 80 Years Later, Will History Repeat Itself? And an event during the COVID pandemic dealt with living, experiencing, reflecting in the midst of unfolding global turmoil. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the atrocities committed during this ongoing war led to working with Ukrainian psychoanalysts and psychotherapists in a series of meetings titled Finding One's Voice, Emerging from Trauma. The primary task of these events was to enable our colleagues from the Ukraine, psychoanalysts and psychotherapists, to regain your voice and to move from the traumatic experiences you have lived through and are still going on. We worked by Zoom with people widely dispersed. Some were in the Ukraine, others found shelter in various countries. In a variety of individual ways, they were all traumatized, finding themselves suddenly under threat of life or as displaced persons without language and the capacity to work. Clearly, the experience accumulated through these various events has enabled us to define and refine our PCCA approach and methodology. It has its own rationale and internal consistency. It draws on the group relations method and adapts it to residues of historical trauma, but it also attempts to deal with ongoing current traumatic events. So, some discussion of this. Many have expressed doubts and reservations about these conferences. Some Jewish colleagues who live in Germany felt offended, insulted. Why could their German colleagues not have these discussions with them? Why import Israeli Jews? Strong objections were also raised in Israel. Israeli colleagues regarded attending the conferences as an act of exoneration and forgiveness, which is met with resistance and refusal. On both sides of the fence, there is great difficulty with the underlying principle and the main lesson of these conferences, which is the presence of the other is a necessary condition for being able to do your own internal work. And I emphasize the presence of the other, the actual presence. If normal intrapsychic capacities shrink under the impact of ordinary trauma, they become severely incapacitated under the impact of communal trauma, and they are tremendously augmented under the horrendous traumatization of the Holocaust. This seriously limits one's ability to work on one's internal state in isolation. The line that divides Germans and Israelis also joins them as distinct and yet in unmistakably different partners in these traumatic historical events and their aftermath. As patients in analysis, we require the presence of the other to do our own work, although, or precisely because, this other had no connection with our own history. In the attempt to deal with what happened in the aftermath of the Holocaust within both Germans and Jews, however, we must also deal with what transpired between them. It makes all the difference in the world if this work takes place entirely at the internal fantasy level or in the actual presence of the other. And it is especially telling when this other represents the psychic and historical reality. This work, therefore, is not about pious absolution or phony exoneration or forgiveness. It is rather about one's personal and national identity and relationships with parents and grandparents, with friends and neighbors, with one's culture and history. Identity was indeed an essential and central theme in this conference. The ordinary Nazi mother is an image of a poisonous breast, exuding venom and death, of which the child is the victim. It was impressive to see the crucial significance of food in the relationship with parents and culture. A German man exclaimed in angry disbelief, "My relationship with my mother was all around fresh potatoes." Food, smell, and touch are the basic elements out of which the earlier sense of self and identity, of psychosomatic existence, and of being firmly rooted in a cultural soil are constructed. But identity, the lifelong sense of our own self and me-ness, is also defined by the image of the other, the not me, which it includes and utilizes. The German identity was burdened with shame and guilt and was experienced as handicapped and incapacitating. The German identity encompasses the Jew as the other, who occupies a special place. He or she is ambivalently regarded as possessing aliveness and wisdom, making him an object of both desire and envious attack. Within the German identity, there seems to be embedded an elemental Jewish component as an idealized, envied, or hated other. In the Israeli Jewish identity, on the other hand, different issues were apparent. The part of the other is not necessarily German. The other for Israelis can take on many different faces: European, Arab, or the catch-all non-Jewish Gentile. It is indeed part of Jewish identity that anyone may take the role of the stranger and persecutor. In this conference, however, for the Israelis, the other became the non-Israeli diaspora Jew. Feared and resented, the anger of the Israeli group threatened to focus on him and to scapegoat him. To an extent, this had to do with the greater affinity of the diaspora Jew to the Germans. In another respect, it represented the hate for the diaspora Jew, who is experienced as the negative of and a threat to the newly won Israeli identity. The issues around identity became even more painful when identity is undergoing change. The changed image of the other sets off a shift in one's perception of oneself. If the other is an invaluable determinant of one's own identity, then as the image of the other undergoes change, it causes the personal and collective group identity to change with it. This exchange is experienced as a serious threat on all psychic levels. It destabilizes one's sense of the world as an organized, coherent, meaningful place. It undermines the clear delineation of good and bad objects, upsetting the habitual patterns of projection and creating havoc with ambivalent splits of love and hate. It upsets the primitive schizoparanoid order and hinders progressive movement to a depressive integration. Worst of all, however, It undermines one's ties and roots in psychic and social reality. The changed perception of the other militates against the view of the world that was part of the emotional ties with one's parents and family. It is an assault on the family ego. In the system event, which threatens to identity clearly emerge as German and Israeli came in close contact, because the conference has shaken deeply established identity patterns by shaking and changing one's view of oneself and the other, it produced a disarray, tension, and upset that I described. It is difficult to give up familiar roles, such as the role of the guilty perpetrator for the Germans and that of the eternal victim for the Israelis. The overriding danger that blocks change is the fear of betrayal of parents, relatives, and culture, and the associated shame and guilt. We want to close this brief and almost impossible account on a personal note. It cannot be emphasized enough how unique and different it was to work in these conferences. It feels entirely different from any other group relations conference we have worked in, and the taking up of the professional role and responsibilities is colored by these differences. We, as well as our colleagues, felt a sense of mission, of contributing to and being part of an endeavor of historical and social significance that reaches far beyond and the immediate. There is a strong feeling of camaraderie and identification with the members, and envy of their being in the members' role. This identification with members, who often are professional colleagues and friends, makes it difficult to work with them without being either too close or too distant. The small study group's consultants reviewed the way they took up their role in this conference, which felt very different from the usual mode. We found that our preferred stance was on the boundary between a group relations and a facilitation mode, at times even on the boundary of group psychotherapy. We accepted the working definition of our role to be partnership in search of understanding. And finally, it needs to be clear that the aim of these conferences is not therapeutic. It is not group analysis or group psychotherapy, both of which strive to alleviate personal suffering associated with personal conflict, deprivation, and psychopathology. Instead, the focus of these conferences is not the individual, but the group process. And the aim is learning about oneself, about hatreds and prejudice, the projections that interfere with relationships and relatedness, the threats to identity, and the meaning and burden of belonging to a social, ethnic, or national group with a traumatogenic history. One learns, or better said, one may learn, about the residual effects of historical trauma and their living manifestations in one's psyche and life. Our experience indicates that such learning may bring about significant internal change, but we must leave it to the individual participants and to you, our audience, to reflect on whether such change can be called therapeutic. So here I end this part, and Mira will now continue. What? Okay. All right. So here we are.
Shall I go on now, or shall we pause?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So A few days ago, we conducted a conference under the title War in Ukraine, a space to share and reflect in the midst of an ongoing war. And I'll show you the flyer of this event. This was a new and experimental event as it was held during an ongoing war with its immediate effects and not about residues of a past atrocity. The ongoing war that started with a brutal invasion of Russia into the Ukraine presented a challenge to PCCA. If we respect its name, partners in confronting collective atrocities, we must respond to such an atrocity using the tool that we have developed over 30 years. Yet, it is a quantum leap from working with past atrocities to working with an atrocity in the making. The question was, are our tools fit to face this challenge? The experimental nature of the event was described to participants as sailing in uncharted waters. We are less than a week after this intensive event, and it is too soon to draw conclusions. We also have yet to get reflections from participants about how they experience the event. So for the moment, let me just describe shortly what we did and the first tentative conclusions. The invitation was to participate in a virtual event aimed at providing a space to reflect on the war in Ukraine and its reverberations. The assumption was that this ongoing war has a far-reaching effect on all of us. Those who are directly affected, Ukrainian, whose lives were shattered from one moment to another, whether by staying in place and being threatened, by finding shelter in safer place, being displaced, or even as refugees. It also impacts those in neighboring countries who try to reach out and help, and all those not directly affected, but whose illusion of a safe world was shattered. The political, military, and economic fallouts are still in the making. The refugee crisis, with more international and internally displaced people than at any time since World War II, is posing a massive challenge. We will all be at the receiving end of the shortage of grains and fuel. For millions, or hundreds of millions maybe, it will mean higher prices, hunger, and a cold winter. Second and third generation of World War II and of other wars are revisited by the shadow of the past. The primary task of this event was defined as to provide the space in the midst of an evolving war to reflect on where this war meets everyone in light of their personal and collective past, present, and future. The aim is to gain a better understanding of what we, wherever we are going through by bringing together people from different countries who are differently related to the unfolding events. We ended up with 48 participants who came from 15 countries. There was one person registered from Brazil, but at the end he didn't show up. The members who participated were from North America in the west to Taiwan in the east, with many European countries, including Ukrainians and Russians in exile. The event took place 3 days in a row, 6 hours every day. It was composed of groups that worked in different formats, small, large, plenary, and institutional event, as Shmuel described. It was very intensive and meaningful to the participants, but it was not easy, at times difficult and lonely. We could note some specific and different dynamics from other conferences that were at work. We could see the work of fragmentation, exclusion, lack of trust, an attempt at aggressive invasion of privacy. There was no playfulness nor intimacy, though there was longing for this. The dreams that were shared held deception and threat and were a really nightmare. Lack of trust in leadership and institution was apparent. Although at the overt level, participants came with open arms toward Ukrainians, unconsciously we could see ambivalence and keeping a distance, thus reducing the Ukrainian participants into the victim role, although they did not see themselves as such, and they spoke about an experienced victory. As one participant said, all PCCA events until now, in the last 30 years, were a preparation for this one. We mounted this event because we thought that this is what we can contribute to the community at this time. It was a risk we took because it was uncharted water. Many said it required courage. We think it worked. Thank you for your attention. And I think now we are open to questions.
Obrigada, doutora Shmuel, doutor Mira, pela apresentação de vocês. É sempre emocionante ouvir o relato de vocês, estudar o trabalho de vocês, e agora ouvindo o relato da doutora Mira sobre o trabalho com, né, a respeito do trauma que estamos vivendo, a guerra da Ucrânia, impacta também. Eu vou abrir para, não sei, Cláudio, tu queres fazer algum comentário agora ou abrimos para perguntas?
Eu só queria dizer exatamente, não por acaso, como tu, que é comovente e emocionante ouvir duas experiências, uma com os descendentes dos que viveram os horrores do Holocausto, dos dois lados, como também ouvir os que estão vivendo a guerra, no momento em que a guerra está ocorrendo. Eu não sei se tem alguma outra atividade ou intervenção psicanalítica como esta que foi feita, está sendo feita, e mostra como a psicanálise pode estar presente nessas situações. Mas talvez depois eu possa dizer mais alguma coisa. Obrigado.
Claro. Então, só para quem quiser fazer alguma pergunta ou algum comentário, na barra de baixo da tela tem um levantar a mão, né? E aí, então, pode clicar ali e vamos, então, passando de 2 em 2 pessoas para a tela, para fazerem comentários, enfim, depois... Então, Grayson, por favor, o Ruggiero, o Levi e o Luiz Pelanda, pode colocar eles na tela. Ruggiero.
Bom, antes de tudo, eu queria saudar muito o Shmuel e a Mira de estarem presentes aqui na nossa sociedade. O Shmuel, que foi meu parceiro do board, e que tivemos a oportunidade de fazer alguns trabalhos juntos, e a Mira, enfim, que eu sempre tive contato e que eu gosto muito e admiro muito. E o meu comentário, basicamente, é para parabenizar vocês pelo longo, complexo, profundo, nobre, essencial trabalho que vocês vêm desenvolvendo ao longo desses anos. É realmente admirável a dedicação de vocês na elaboração dessas situações traumáticas, seja do Holocausto, seja agora que a Mira nos trouxe essa experiência muito impressionante sobre a elaboração do trauma em andamento, né, da guerra da Ucrânia, enfim, da invasão russa. O trabalho grupal que vocês fazem é realmente impressionante, né, pela capacidade de continência que vocês têm que ter e que o grupo de coordenadores tem que ter em situações onde emoções tão violentas e tão intensas se fazem presentes, né? E ele me lembra um pouco os trabalhos de working parties, só que em outra dimensão, quer dizer, com outra magnitude, quer dizer, tanto pela violência das emoções que estão presentes, né, como pela quantidade de participantes que estão envolvidos. Então, isso também impressiona muito. Mas eu pensei em ilustrar a questão dos resíduos traumáticos com duas situações. Eu vou procurar não me alongar muito, sabe? Uma vez eu fui convidado pela IPSO para fazer uma supervisão de uma análise de um neto de um nazista. Uma análise realizada por uma analista alemã. Este rapaz tinha uma perversão sexual onde o gozo dele acontecia no momento em que ele simulava o estrangulamento da parceira sexual dele. E depois se entende, na história dele, que a mãe dele, que era filha de um oficial nazista, havia se suicidado quando ele tinha 9 anos. E ele tinha escutado a mãe descendo as escadas para se enforcar e não fez nada. E, a partir dali, ele se sentiu culpado pela morte da mãe. E ele fez uma identificação com um avô assassino nazista. E isto deu origem a uma perversão sexual. Então, eu queria escutar vocês, né, sobre essa transmissão transgeneracional que passa por 3, 4 gerações, né, e que se instala muitas vezes como sintomas neuróticos ou sintomas perversos importantes. Claro, sem falar do suicídio da filha deste oficial nazista. Por outro lado, uma outra experiência de uma jovem amiga minha israelense, que era filha de sobreviventes de campos de concentração. Ela trabalhava num kibbutz que era bombardeado diariamente. Cansada dos bombardeios, ela resolveu emigrar para Boston, para trabalhar como educadora de crianças em Boston. Chegando em Boston, ela teve uma situação de estresse traumático com sintomas de estresse pós-traumático. Ela não sabia o que estava acontecendo, até que um dia ela se deu conta que o apartamento dela era do lado de uma estação de trem e que cada vez que o apito do trem tocava, ela tinha sintomas de extrema ansiedade aguda. E ela, então, associou com a experiência da mãe dela nos trens que levavam para Auschwitz. Então, pobre coitada, depois teve o atentado em Boston. Então, ela, para fugir das bombas em Israel, acabou se deparando com as bombas em Boston. Então, são situações, enfim, que eu pensei em partilhar com vocês para ilustrar o que vocês estão trazendo e para escutar vocês sobre tudo isso. Mas, no mais, muito obrigado. E um prazer rever vocês.
Obrigada, Ruggero. Eu vou passar a palavra para o Pelanda e depois eu passo para vocês responderem, pode ser? Doutor Shmuel, doutora Mira. Então, Pelanda.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Quero agradecer muito, tanto à nossa sociedade quanto aos doutores Erlich, porque este é um tema de relevância essencial e que eu vejo a psicanálise assumindo o seu papel social com muito gosto. Sempre foi o meu desejo. Eu quero relatar uma pequena experiência pessoal. Eu sempre fui aluno de colégios públicos e tive sempre muitos amigos judeus, muito amigos, mas para eles eu era goi. Eu era o estranho. Quando o Oswaldo Aranha assinou o decreto criando o Estado de Israel, eu olhei para os meus colegas, bom, agora vocês vão ter um outro problema, é de que vocês vão ter uma nacionalidade. Vocês vão deixar de ser só brasileiros, vocês vão ser brasileiros israelenses. Vamos ver como é que vocês vão resolver isso. Eu penso, ao longo desses 60 anos de psicanálise, que com o novo paradigma em que a gente se dá conta de que a construção de si e a construção de conhecimento são simultâneos pelo acoplamento que a gente tem com o seu meio, e que essas crianças, o meio, eram os pais nazistas ou os pais... Não é? Eu imagino como é que é uma mãe russa hoje. Não é? Então, eu acho que há um momento novo no mundo, na psicanálise, mas, assim, uma consciência de que não se pode permitir que as guerras sigam assim, sem nada. Não é? Bom, agradecer a tudo. Mas eu gostaria, antes de encerrar, mandar um happy birthday para o Dr. Otto Kerber, que está de aniversário hoje. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Pelanda. Vocês querem comentar alguma coisa, doutor Shmuel, doutora Mira?
Yeah. Well, first, I think, yes, I will cite Louis saying that psychoanalysis is stepping up to its societal role. And I think, yes, this is, I think, one of our deepest beliefs, that psychoanalysis has, its flagship is individual psychoanalysis in the office, but psychoanalysis can offer much more than that, and should offer. And it's our ethical obligation to make use of our tools and of our understanding to the ailment of society. Ailment of society is always carried by individuals, but the treatment, so to say, the intervention is should not be only in personal interventions, but that there are group interventions, societal interventions that have psychoanalytic understanding behind them. And our work is really part of it. So, yes, so I agree very much with this. And, Ruggero, your examples are really excellent, beautiful demonstrations of how transgenerational transmission of trauma is working. And without the subject knowing it, many times people come to analysis, they don't know what they are suffering from. And as you described, it takes sometimes deep analysis, and at other time, incidents that happens in life that brings out the traumas and open up the possibility to work. So we know in our Israeli, not only the Holocaust second, third generation, but Israelis who are who have post-traumatic syndromes, and they don't know that they are related to their army service. And it can take 20, 30 years until they come to a kind of therapy or analysis and make the connection to understand that what they are suffering from has to do with their experiences in the army 20 years ago. Thank you for your examples.
Okay, first of all, it's a pleasure to see you, Rogero, and you, Dr. Palanda. I of course agree with what Mira said, but I want to also take it one step further, because you have beautifully demonstrated the psychoanalytic way in which we can understand post-traumatic and transgenerational transmission of trauma. And I think these are very, very valuable demonstrations. However, they are still at the level of the individual. And psychoanalysis has been very good with that. You know, that has been something psychoanalysis learned how to do and does it rather well. What we are trying to do with this work is to go beyond the individual and to see how either a whole society or a part of the society or a group or an institution or whatever is also affected transgenerationally by residues of trauma and other historical roots that are involved in its formation. And this is something then at the group and organizational level. You know, so the same thing that you can so well see with the individual patient, I think we are trying to also see that in terms of larger social entities. And it is psychoanalytic still, because it's informed by psychoanalysis, but it also requires the input of something that combines with psychoanalysis. And that is what I talked about with the group relations methodology. Now, you talked in the beginning about containment. And I thought that this is a very important point, containment. How does one contain all this stuff? Sometimes very difficult. Well, you can turn it around and say, how do you, as a psychoanalyst, contain some of the horrible things that you're dealing with, that come up in the room, that come up from the couch? They're also not easy to contain. What helps you in that is the psychoanalytic frame, the psychoanalytic identity, the psychoanalytic attitude, the stance, etc., etc. These are things that help you contain. And in a real analogy, what the group relations methodology has enabled us is to contain these things at the group level. That is really its great contribution to my mind. It's very psychoanalytic in that sense. Even when it doesn't speak in psychoanalytic terms, it is still very psychoanalytic. Okay, so that's one issue, the containment. I also wanted to say something about the Dr. Palanda touched on the Jewish and the Jewish Israeli identity, because of course that's a real issue, and it was an issue even when we started these conferences. You know, when we started the conference, in the primary task, we said something about thoughts. We want to explore thoughts, fantasies, whatever comes up, around Germanness, and then what is the counterpart? And the counterpart, there was a sort of a controversy between me at the time and Raphael Moses. I don't know if Cláudio knew Raphael Moses. He wanted Israeliness. And I said, no, it's not Israeliness, it's Jewishness. And we compromised by saying there is Germanness and there is Israeliness, Jewishness, hyphenated. Because, of course, Israeli identity is also complex. And when we started to include Palestinians, who are Israelis, they're Israeli citizens, we met this problem in a very, very difficult way. It was very difficult. So, first of all, this exists also in the Israeli identity. And secondly, I just wanted to say, when you said about Russian mothers, I wonder, because, of course, I don't know, but it could be a projection, because I think there may be, perhaps, given Russian propaganda by Putin and others, maybe some of these mothers accept it in a way that you and I would think is terrible. But they may still feel that this is a sacrifice on behalf of the motherland, the fatherland, or whatever, So this is, again, an issue of how can we understand what goes on in a different society, a different culture, and beyond the walls of propaganda, of what the newspapers give us, what the television says, etc., etc. We have to be very careful.
Obrigada. Grayson, por favor, coloca Altamiranda Andrade e Augusto Ferrari na tela.
Agora me ouvem?
Agora sim. Uhum.
Okay, obrigado. Bom dia a todos. Eu queria primeiro cumprimentar a Sociedade Psicanalítica de Porto Alegre, Maria Cristina Garcia Vasconcellos, presidente, por essa iniciativa extremamente importante, a todos os queridos colegas que eu estou vendo aí, e aos queridos amigos Mira e Shmuel. Prazer grande voltar a estar em contato com vocês. Como lembrou o Ruggiero, também trabalhei junto com o Ruggiero e Shmuel no board da IPA, fomos colegas, e Mira também trabalhamos em algumas situações juntos, Bom, o importantíssimo trabalho de vocês me evocou muita coisa. Uma delas é o nosso trabalho, nós buscamos reparações, reparar traumas, reparar situações destrutivas da vida de cada um, situações de vida precária, buscamos a reparação. Eu acredito que o trabalho de vocês, o Shmuel deixa isso claro ao longo de toda a conferência, de buscar reparar, buscar pontes, buscar contato, buscar desenvolvimento humano, E isso me parece da maior importância, É algo que, embora seja difícil, os depoimentos que o Shmuel colocou demonstra realmente a dificuldade, como é difícil, mas temos que seguir em frente. Embora seja humano, demasiado humano, nós todos acreditamos na humanidade e no ser humano. Essas as duas apresentações me evocaram algumas coisas. Uns anos atrás, num debate na minha sociedade sobre um debate sobre um trabalho do psicanalista Henrik Onigstein sobre narcisismo criativo baseado em Goethe e narcisismo destrutivo baseado em Hitler, tinha na plateia um senhor, Alexander Henrik Lax. Esse senhor era um sobrevivente do Holocausto, de Auschwitz. Esse senhor tinha 92 anos nessa época. Eu já o conhecia há muitos anos, porque ele era pai de um colega psiquiatra meu contemporâneo. Bom, esse senhor fez uma discussão, falou sobre o tema. Em seguida, alguém na plateia diz, mas é admirável ver um senhor da sua idade participando de um debate aqui na Sociedade, sábado de manhã. ele disse, eu tenho uma missão. A minha missão de vida até me emociona. A minha missão de vida é viver o máximo possível para contar o que eu passei, o que passaram aqueles meus outros amigos que sobreviveram, o povo que sobreviveu, os 6 milhões que morreram e todas as famílias envolvidas. Eu tenho que contar, porque nós temos que entender o que aconteceu para que não se repita, e as futuras gerações têm que ter clareza do que aconteceu. Essa é a minha missão. E ele levou essa missão até os 102 anos. Quando o senhor Alexander Lax falava, eu me lembrei das palavras do Shmuel Erlich em 2007, no Congresso da IPA em Berlim. O Shmuel disse algo parecido. Talvez você possa se lembrar melhor do que eu, mas eu não me lembro as suas palavras, mas o sentido era de que, embora estejamos aqui num clima emocional pesado e muito forte, estamos propondo um debate, uma discussão para criar entendimentos, para que isso fique para as futuras gerações. Foi o que me lembrou, foi a ponte. Bom, na fala do Shmuel também, tem uma hora que ele fala sobre a Conferência de Chipre, não é? E nessa conferência o título pergunta se ainda era possível voltar a acontecer de novo. Eu não me lembro as palavras, mas o sentido me parece esse, assim. E eu me lembrei aqui do seguinte, a semana passada eu estava conversando com um amigo meu que voltou de férias de Paris. Esse amigo é judeu. E ele disse, eu vou lhe contar uma história que passou comigo e com meu primo em Paris. Eu fui à casa do meu primo e nós saímos para passear, para andar por Paris. E o meu primo estava com um kippá, não é? E nós entramos numa loja. Quando nós entramos numa loja, 2 franceses olharam para a gente e disseram, juí, né? Judeu, e num tom assim de nojo, de coisa. Eles ficaram impactados e na loja todos riram, debochando deles 2. Eles ficaram apavorados e saíram, não é? E o meu amigo me disse, eu fiquei muito perturbado, porque eu aqui no Brasil nunca passei por isso, nem em outros países que eu viajei. E ele comentando com o primo disse, aqui na França isso está acontecendo muito. Portanto, nós temos que sim, trazer a atualidade do trabalho de vocês, porque está aí agora na Ucrânia acontecendo, numa escala menor aconteceu em vários países aí pelo mundo, tem ameaça no Brasil de um presidente psicopata e nazista, que nós todos estamos apavorados. Temos situações no mundo todo, e como esse desse meu querido amigo que passou em Paris essa situação. Portanto, é necessário conversar sobre isso e é necessário a conversa psicanalítica, porque, como vocês disseram, e os outros que me precederam, é preciso pensar psicanaliticamente sobre esses aspectos coletivos, grupais e individuais de destrutividade. É preciso falar o máximo possível, é preciso que todos tenhamos a missão do senhor Alexander Lax de não deixar que isso se repita, não é? Isso é muito importante. Parabéns a vocês, à sociedade, é um prazer. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, Altamirando. Eu vou passar a palavra para o Augusto. Nós temos, além do Augusto, depois o Cláudio, que está inscrito, mais 4 pessoas inscritas, então eu vou ter que encerrar as inscrições, porque temos um horário previsto para terminar ao meio-dia, para que a gente possa, né, contemplar também o nosso horário. Então, infelizmente, eu vou ter que encerrar as inscrições. Augusto?
Ok, obrigado. Bom dia a todos, a todas. Eu quero falar, assim, muito rapidamente, apenas para, enfim, cumprimentar a doutora Mira, o doutor Shmuel, agradecer pela presença deles aqui nesse encontro para estudar esse tema tão, traumas coletivos, um tema tão importante e tão urgente em nossos dias, né? Mas apenas para, assim, sublinhar aquilo que vai ao encontro do que já foi abordado a respeito, assim, de a conferência termina se perguntando, uma das conferências do Dr. Shmuel, este trabalho, este método é terapêutico, ele nos indaga e diz, bem, deixo para o leitor pensar e refletir. Eu queria dar a minha opinião de que, e gostaria que até eles pudessem falar um pouco mais sobre isso, de que sim, este é uma abordagem psicanalítica que, em termos das urgentes necessidades da cultura, é, sim, terapêutica. Está, então, portanto, assim, como uma ferramenta, né, que nos ajuda, inclusive, a doutora Mira nos conta sobre esse processo assim, de intervenção durante a própria guerra. Então, como um processo, sim, terapêutico. Acho que é preciso que possamos, psicanalistas, estar, digamos, mais abertos, como está se falando hoje aqui, né, a essas, digamos, essa nova frente, que não é só os tratamentos individuais, que está muito bem atendido, né, nesses últimos, enfim, nesses 100 anos de psicanálise, que temos esse desafio, que é poder avançar em direção à cultura. Bom, era isso, e queria, então, cumprimentar e pedir que, se eles pudessem falar um pouquinho mais sobre esse aspecto, assim, de, sim, é uma abordagem terapêutica. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Augusto. Cláudio.
Não quer que eles respondam primeiro?
Eu acho que não, porque, bom, tá, pode ser, então, é que eu tenho medo que a gente passe muito do horário. Quem sabe coloca a tua pergunta, eu estou tentando organizar para...
Tá, tudo bem. Eu gostaria de também colocar uma questão. Eu acho que vários pontos excelentes foram levantados até agora, e eu queria falar de um assunto brasileiro. Nós estamos comemorando 200 anos da independência do Brasil. E estamos vivendo, como disse o Altamirano, uma situação política muito preocupante. Mas, na identidade pessoal e histórica, que o Shmuel e a Mira falaram, do Brasil, existe uma coisa muito importante, que é o racismo estrutural. E, lendo esse trabalho, e nós já discutimos isso, em que medida, é uma pergunta hipotética, porque vocês não trabalham com isso, mas me ocorreu que esse tipo de atividade poderia também ser utilizada para enfrentar essa situação do racismo, que depois de 300 anos de escravidão, 300 anos, ainda hoje existe uma ampla presença do racismo na sociedade brasileira, que está sendo enfrentada, que está sendo estudada e que está sendo ativamente. Há muitos estudos e há muita preocupação psicanalítica também com esse assunto. Então, não sei como é que vocês imaginam que se também poderia eventualmente se pensar nesse tipo de trabalho em que a identidade pessoal e histórica de raças diferentes pudessem ser alvo de uma atenção psicanalítica.
Obrigada, Cláudio. Vocês podem, então, responder.
Okay, I'll start with a thought of that came from Altamiranda, which is the healing aspect has to be differentiated from reconciliation. Like the aim the aim of the work is not reconciliation toward the other one, but to do an internal work. And the internal work can be to get rid of the shadows of the parents, of the shadow of the past, and to meet the reality as it is. One, and to recognize, and maybe this ties with Cláudio's point, the racism, the hatred, the aggression in oneself. So the split between the good guys and the bad guys collapses without denying the historical facts, without denying that Russia invaded in February Ukraine. But to hold to the complexity and not to give up, not to give in to simple splitting is the path to healing.
Okay, I thought that both Altamiranda and Dr. Ferrari, I very much agree with you, and I think also Cláudio said the same thing. We are dealing with issues. I mean, to speak of the Holocaust is, of course, as terrible as it is, it's 80 years ago. And we are, all of us, under the impact of very current, very difficult issues, social issues that you're all aware of. I don't have to list them. They have to do with what Mira was just talking about, the very deep splits that we see and experience in each of our societies. And I don't mean psychoanalytic societies. I mean our social societies. So there's no question about the importance of this project and this way of looking at things and working with them for current issues. At the same time, I just want to say, just to be realistic, it is also very difficult. It is very difficult. On the one hand, this method has proved itself as very powerful. People who have been analysts and not analysts, who have been to group relations conference, have often said that they got more out of the 1 week in a group relations conference than they did in their 5 years or 10 years of analysis. Because it's so intense and you're confronted with yourself in a way that is inescapable. So the method is very powerful. But at the same time, first of all, it has its limits. Secondly, as anything, also psychoanalysis, the method itself can become politicized. I just want to say, or give one example. The issue of slavery that Cláudio touched on is such an important issue in the United States for obvious reasons. In a way, you might say it was and is and still is their cultural, historical trauma. They did not get out of it. They had one terrible civil war in which, I don't know, I don't remember how many, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and they're still not out of that. There is a struggle between white supremacy and otherness, and the United States is, of course, as a society going through tremendous diversity, as are other societies nowadays. The British society, now that the Queen died, in her lifetime, it changed from a small minority of others to now, I just read 1 in 7 British people is of color. 1 in 7. That's a tremendous amount. So diversity is an issue everywhere. It's an issue that, to my mind, in the United States, have become so involved in and so engrossed in with this work. The group relations work has, in a way, become subjected to that. That's what I mean by politicized. So, we need to be very, very, not only careful, but very clever, very intelligent about how we do this. Because in many ways, it can even promote diversity and narcissism, the narcissism of small or large differences we were talking about. But the one thing I certainly agree with, and I'm glad you all mentioned it, I think psychoanalysis is now at a point in time where it is much more ready to accept the fact that these social dynamics and social issues are something that psychoanalysis must in some way find ways to deal with. Freud wrote about it, but since Freud, we became an established profession with the, in a way, narcissistic aura of who is a pure psychoanalyst, the one who sits in his office all day and sees patients from morning to night and does not get involved, in social issues. One quote that I like very much, a teacher of mine when I started to study psychology, he said that when the Bastille was stormed, the well-analyzed people stayed home. Okay? And that has been true for a very long time. Maybe it's still true, but I think there are now indications like this meeting, like your concerns, like Mira's committee in the IPA, like the committee that Cláudio and I belong to, where there is a shift. It's not yet a major shift, but it is a shift, and it needs to be nurtured. We don't have to give up doing psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is very important because it teaches us about these things, but we also need to be open to looking at social dynamics in a way that transcends psychoanalysis. So I very much like the responses that, not only in terms of the friendship that was here, which I very much value and appreciate, but also because they indicate to me that there is openness and readiness for this. So in that sense, really, thank you very much, and I'm glad we could have this dialogue.
Obrigada, doutora Shmuel. Eu vou passar, alguém desistiu de falar, mas então temos 3 pessoas, eu vou passar as 3 agora para a tela. Ana Rosa Trachtenberg, Débora
Dani, tradução.
Débora Regina Unikovsky e Bernard Miodovnik, por favor, Grayson. Eu vou pedir que sejam breves, porque nós temos 10 para o meio-dia, né? Esse é um assunto que a gente poderia ficar aqui, né, muito tempo, e possivelmente vamos, quem sabe, pensar em novos encontros para debater um tema que é tão instigante e captura, mas infelizmente temos um tempo a cumprir aqui. Então, o primeiro é a Ana Rosa, por favor. Está mudo o teu microfone, Ana.
Bom dia, muito obrigada à Sociedade Psicanalítica de Porto Alegre, Cristina, Cláudio, um prazer, uma alegria escutar o Shmuel e a Mira nesse trabalho tão importante. Eu sei que agora temos pouco tempo, eu teria várias coisas a comentar, me fiquei muito interessada nessa proposta do Cláudio, complementada também pelos colegas e pelo Shmuel e pela Mira, sobre a possibilidade de nós, no Brasil, trabalharmos dentro desses resíduos transgeracionais sociais relacionados ao racismo, né? Sabemos tão pouco disso e fomos aprendendo nos últimos anos. Estamos bastante acostumados dentro da complexidade da mente e do trabalho psicanalítico com as manifestações e os resíduos transgeracionais a nível individual, os trabalhos de Abraham Torok, os resíduos radioativos de Jolanta Gampel. E eu queria também lembrar, e aí vai a minha pergunta para o casal Erlich, René Caes falou em algum momento a respeito da necessidade social de manter um período de latência na humanidade com relação a este silêncio que observamos nos sobreviventes do Holocausto como padrão, o silêncio, a clivagem, a colocação numa cripta como uma necessidade de defesa, de sobrevivência e de poder olhar para o futuro. Não é? E sabemos que a tentativa de colocar em palavras o que está silenciado é muito ameaçador como uma retraumatização. Então, no trabalho que vocês fazem, como é que se vê esse movimento? Eu não chamaria isso de resistência, eu acho que tem outro nome, não é? A nossa clássica resistência, né? Mas queria escutar de você se este é um ponto importante ou não. E queria deixar só como uma referência, aqui no Brasil, se quiserem ver, tem uma cineasta brasileira, europeia, ela circula pelo mundo, que se chama Cláudia Sobral, que está no YouTube, que fez um documentário chamado Os Fantasmas do Terceiro Reich, em que ela entrevista descendentes de perpetradores, que é extremamente interessante. Enfim, e queria saudar muito a entrada com vigor da psicanálise para a revalorização do trauma e do social e do poder que a psicanálise tem para nós trabalharmos psicanaliticamente na área social. Muito obrigada, eu vou ficar por aqui porque eu queria escutá-los. Um bom dia.
Obrigada, Ana Rosa. Agora eu não me lembro quem é que estava na frente, mas eu vou passar então a palavra para a Débora e depois para o Bernardo, pode ser?
Bom dia a todos, um prazer estar aqui com vocês. E a minha questão, várias coisas me impressionaram muito, gostei, adorei a apresentação, os comentários, mas eu queria fazer uma pergunta bastante específica a respeito dessa diferença nas conferências em Israel e na Alemanha, do comportamento dos israelenses em Israel e na Alemanha e dos alemães em Israel e na Alemanha. Chamou muita atenção essa questão dos alemães parecerem muito ativos quando em Israel e os israelenses mais passivos, e o contrário na Alemanha. Me chamou muita atenção isso. Eu pensei, além da questão da possibilidade desse par antitético ativo e passivo, né, como se fosse no dado Freud, ter também essa questão do geográfico, né, porque vocês falaram a importância da presença do outro, como se tem na análise também, mas essa questão do geográfico, porque tiveram outras conferências em várias partes do mundo, né, mas vocês salientaram essa diferença especificamente quando em Israel e quando na Alemanha. E eu acho que isso também está muito ligado com o que vocês falaram sobre a sensação de traição, né, e de vergonha. Enfim, eu queria ouvir mais vocês a respeito disso. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Débora. Bernardo?
Bom dia a todos e a todas. Primeiro, queria parabenizar e agradecer à SPPA pela organização deste evento e também aos doutores Shmuel e Mira pela conferência e por ter me permitido conhecer esse monumental trabalho que vocês têm feito há mais de uma década. A minha pergunta é rápida, mais em relação a uma situação específica, porque eu vi que vocês fizeram uma conferência numa cidade da Polônia, né? Então, diferente da Alemanha, que de alguma forma procurou reparações, procurou uma elaboração e criou leis bastante severas em relação à possibilidade de uma nazificação, quer dizer, a Polônia, ao contrário, não fez esse tipo de reparação, não fez esse tipo de reflexão e, pelo contrário, até criminalizou associar situações da Polônia com o Holocausto, né? Eu pergunto isso até por um interesse muito pessoal, que é de onde meus pais vieram da Polônia, né? E Altamirano mencionou, quer dizer, essa situação da França, quer dizer, o quanto essas situações não elaboradas, quer dizer, porque a França também, de alguma forma, não fez uma elaboração ao seu colaboracionismo, e eu acho que também a gente pode trazer aqui para o Brasil, né, que lembraram, né, quer dizer, também não houve uma elaboração em relação às questões da ditadura que nós vivemos, e estamos novamente ameaçados que isso retorne novamente. Agradecer novamente, obrigado, SPPA e doutor Shmuel, doutora Mira. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Bernardo. Vocês, doutor Shmuel, doutora Mira.
There's not much time to go through these. These are very important questions. I just want to say 2 points relate to. One about Poland, to start from the end. You're quite right. This was a major move to move the conference A to Europe, and B, at the time it was important to deal with what looked like European issue, and we called the conference European Victims and Perpetrators, Now and Then. And we even did a preliminary event before this in Krakow, with many Polish people attending at the university. And it was very interesting that to this first conference in Poland, I think there were 3 or 4 Poles who came, that was all. Okay, so I think the point what you're pointing to, the issue, the difficulty in that society, which has a very deep historic relationship with its Jewish population. And of course, it did not create Auschwitz, but it had a very, very meaningful part in it. That was an issue that is still around, and there's still even diplomatic controversies going on around that, Polish laws and so on. I don't know how much you know about that, but it's a real issue. So that's one point. And it relates to the point Deborah was making, because I think you talked about geography, and I think geography is indeed important. I also thought about the fact that when the Israelis were the hosts, they were rather passive. And when the Germans were the hosts in Germany, they became very passive. So I thought it also contributed, because at least in Germany, it was quite clear that the Germans were very worried about the Jews coming to Germany. There was a lot of anxiety, that came out in different ways and so on. So there was anxiety about that. And in that sense, I think geography does play a role, as with Poland and with the other places we were in, France and so on. But that's a huge issue that I don't think we can cover in the few minutes we have left, or not even have left yet, because we are beyond the time limit.
Just to refer to Ana Rosa, the silence of the survivors meets the unwillingness to listen of the society at large. So when the society doesn't want to hear, the survivors cannot speak.
Bom, muito obrigada. Cláudio, tu queres dizer alguma coisa antes da gente encerrar?
Não, só queria agradecer muito ao Shmuel, a Mira e a todos os colegas presentes e aos que levantaram perguntas e comentários, e dizer que nós estamos realmente unidos nesse esforço internacional da psicanálise, e isso já vem há muitos anos, como vocês estão trabalhando, e todos nós, de uma forma também, da importância da psicanálise como uma voz quando há ameaças de intolerância, quando há resíduos traumáticos do passado e situações presentes de grande ameaça. Nós estamos presentes com a nossa voz, com a nossa posição, e não precisamos ficar em casa mais quando cair a Bastilha. Nós também somos cidadãos da polis, como todos os demais. Muito obrigado, queridos Shmuel e Mira.
Obrigada, Cláudio. Vocês gostariam de dizer alguma coisa, doutor Shmuel, doutora Mira, para encerrarmos?
Just thank you so much for this opportunity and your generosity and invitation. And, you know, I wish we could do it face to face, but maybe that will happen also someday. So thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Ok. Bom, então quem sabe já fica combinado, como dizemos aqui, né? Um encontro presencial, quem sabe em um outro momento vocês podem voltar, porque certamente ficaram muitas questões em aberto, tem muito a refletir, a pensar, e eu quero agradecer muito a vocês por estarem aqui conosco hoje e a todos os que também participaram. E tenham todos, então, um bom fim de semana. Depois desta grande manhã de sábado.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Tchau.